At exactly
Enemy
9:42 in the
movement, sector
morning on
right.
September
Copy,
15,
sir. Taking
1944,
position.
Corporal
Fire at
Jacob
will. Hold
Mitchell
the line.
crouched in the jagged white coral of
Fire
the
on that
Umerbergal
bridge.
pocket and watched a Japanese
Target
officer
hit.
kill his friends from
Good.
half a
Next
mile
position.
away. The heat on Peleliu was already 115
Keep
degrees. It
pushing.
was a wet, suffocating blanket that made the air shimmer like water boiling on a stove. But Jake did not feel the heat. He only felt the sharp edge of the coral digging into his knees and the heavy thud of mortar rounds walking up the valley floor like the footsteps of an angry god. 400 yards ahead, the jungle had been stripped away by naval gunfire. What remained was a moonscape of white rock and black ash. And standing on a limestone ridge exactly 800 yards to the north was the man responsible for the butchery. The Japanese officer stood in plain sight. He was not hiding. He was not crawling through the mud or pressing himself flat into a bunker. He stood tall, wearing a pressed uniform that looked impossibly clean against the gray rock. He held a pair of binoculars in one hand and a map case in the other. To the exhausted, bleeding Marines of the 1st Division, this man looked like a ghost, or maybe a god. He would raise his hand, point to a cluster of rocks, and 10 seconds later, a Japanese mortar team hidden on the reverse slope would drop a shell right on top of a Marine fire team. He was conducting an orchestra of violence with absolute impunity. He knew exactly where the Americans were, and more importantly, he knew exactly what weapons they carried. The standard American infantry rifle in 1944 was the M1 Garand. It was a semi-automatic masterpiece, rugged and reliable, capable of firing 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. But the Garand had a limit. Its effective range was 500 yards. Beyond that distance, the iron sights covered up the entire target and the bullet began to tumble and drift. The Japanese officer was standing at 800 yards. He had done the math. He knew he was untouchable. He knew no American rifle could reach him from that distance. But Jake Mitchell had done the math too, and his math was better. Jake turned his back on the ridge and dragged a long, heavy canvas case out from under a rain-soaked tarp. The case was covered in green mold and wet sand, but the contents inside remained pristine. He unbuckled the leather straps with fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something else. Anticipation, maybe. Or the weight of a promise made 2 years ago over a closed casket draped in an American flag. He pulled out a weapon that looked like it belonged in a museum. Or perhaps a circus. It was a 1903 Springfield, a bolt-action relic from the First World War. The same rifle his father had carried through the trenches of France in 1918. The same rifle that had hung above the fireplace in their small house in Hickory Corners, Michigan, until the day Jake left for boot camp. But it was not the rifle that made the other men in the trench stop cleaning their wounds and stare. It was the scope mounted on top of it. The scope was a Inertal 8 power target optic, and it was absolutely massive. The steel tube was 24 inches long, nearly the same length as the rifle barrel itself. It sat high above the receiver on delicate aluminum mounts that looked like they had been assembled from an erector set. The whole contraption looked less like a tool of war and more like a piece of laboratory equipment, a fragile glass pipe that would shatter if you breathed on it too hard. The men in the trench looked at the rifle, then they looked at Jake, then they laughed. It was a dark, bitter laughter, the kind that comes from men who have seen too much death in too short a time to believe in magic anymore. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Carson shook his head and spat a long stream of tobacco juice onto the white coral. The brown liquid sizzled in the oppressive heat. "You planning to study the stars, Mitchell?" His voice was rough, worn down by years of shouting orders over gunfire. "Or maybe hunt for butterflies?" Carson was 34 years old, a Kentucky coal miner's son who had lied about his age to enlist in 1927. He had seen combat in Nicaragua and China. He had buried more young Marines than he cared to count. 6 months ago at Tarawa, he had watched his own son die on the beach. The boy had been shot through the chest while running toward a pillbox. He had been 19 years old. Now Carson looked at Jake Mitchell, this 20-year-old college boy from Michigan with his mail-order toy, and saw another young man about to get himself killed for no good reason. "That's a mail-order toy, son." Carson pointed at the massive scope with his chin. "That glass tube will fog up in 5 minutes in this humidity, or the first speck of grit will jam the sliding mechanism. Put the toy away and pick up a real rifle before you get yourself killed." Corporal Luis Rodriguez chimed in from across the trench. He was 32 years old, a father of 3 from El Paso. "Kid brought a telescope to a knife fight." He shook his head without humor. "What's next? You gonna calculate the trajectory with a slide rule?" The other Marines laughed again. For the past 3 weeks, they had been fighting in caves and spider holes, engaging the enemy at ranges of 10 feet, sometimes 5, sometimes close enough to smell the fear on each other's breath. The idea of a precision instrument in this meat grinder was offensive to them. Insulting, even. Jake ignored them all. He knew what they saw. They saw a delicate, finicky instrument that had no business in the mud and blood and coral dust. They saw a liability. A college boy playing scientist while real Marines were dying all around him. But Jake saw something else entirely. He saw the only weapon on the entire island capable of bridging the gap between this trench and that ridge. He saw mathematics made flesh. He saw the answer to a problem that conventional infantry rifles could not solve. He set the rifle down on a stack of rotting sandbags and began his work with the focused calm of a watchmaker assembling a delicate timepiece. He wiped a tiny smudge of oil from the ocular lens with a dry cloth he kept in a waterproof pouch. He checked each mount screw, tightening them with painful precision. The scope was so long that he could not simply rest the gun on a rock like you would with a normal rifle. The tube would strike the obstacle before the barrel did. Sergeant Carson watched him work, still shaking his head in disapproval. The damn officer will be gone by the time you finish playing with your science project, Mitchell. War is not a math problem, kid. But Jake knew that war was exactly a math problem. It was a problem of trajectories and velocities and angles. It was a problem of constants and variables. Gravity was always pulling. Wind was always pushing. Temperature changed the density of air. Humidity affected bullet flight. But the mathematics never lied. The mathematics did not care if you were scared or brave. It did not care if you believed in it or not. The math simply was. Jake pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket. It was water-stained and wrinkled, the pages swollen with humidity, but the pencil marks were still legible. He flipped to a page marked 800 yards and ran his finger down a column of numbers he had written out months ago during training at Camp Pendleton in California. Then he pulled out a stub of carpenter's pencil and wrote directly on his left forearm, just below where his sleeve was rolled up against the oppressive heat. 800 yards plus 28 clicks elevation. Right 4 clicks windage. The Japanese officer was standing 800 yards away. The 30 caliber bullet from the Springfield would leave the muzzle traveling at 2,800 feet per second, fast enough to punch through steel plate, fast enough to kill a man before he heard the sound of his own death approaching. But gravity was a constant, relentless force. Over that distance, the bullet would not fly in a straight line. It would arc, it would rise and then fall, dropping out of the sky like a stone thrown from a tall bridge. At 800 yards, the bullet would drop more than 100 inches, more than 8 feet. Jake would have to aim nearly 9 feet above the officer's head just to hit him in the chest. He would have to lob the round into the air like a mortar shell and trust gravity to bring it back down at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place. It was not shooting in the conventional sense. It was mathematics made lethal. It was faith in numbers that most men could not even comprehend. Jake lay down behind the rifle. He pulled the wooden stock into his shoulder, feeling the familiar solid weight of it pressing against his collarbone. He placed his cheek against the comb and peered through the glass. The world rushed toward him. The 8-power magnification cut through the distance like a knife through butter. It erased the heat waves and the smoke. It collapsed space and time. Suddenly, the Japanese officer was not a small, blurry figure on a distant ridge. He was right there, close enough to touch. Jake could see the buttons on his tunic. He could see tiny beads of sweat on his forehead. He could see the way his lips moved as he shouted orders to his men below. The officer's face was young, maybe 30. He had thin lips and sharp cheekbones. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow, barely visible. The mockery from the trench faded away into background noise. The laughter of Sergeant Carson did not matter anymore. The doubt of the other Marines became irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the crosshair floating in the center of the glass tube. That single point of intersection where mathematics met reality. The officer on the ridge turned slightly. He seemed to look directly down the valley, staring right at Jake's position as if he could see through the rocks and smoke and death. But he could not see the Marine. He could not see the rifle. He only saw a pile of coral and dead trees and broken ground. He smiled. It was a confident, arrogant smirk that said he was the master of this battlefield, that he was untouchable, that he was God himself. He raised his hand slowly, preparing to signal another mortar volley, preparing to kill more Americans who had no way to reach him, no way to stop him. But before Jake could adjust the elevation knob, something else pulled at him. A memory sudden and vivid, cutting through the present moment like a knife through silk. He was 14 years old again, standing in the woods outside Hickory Corners on a cold November morning. The frost was still thick on the ground, and his breath came out in white clouds that hung in the perfectly still air. His father stood beside him, patient and quiet, holding the same model Springfield rifle that Jake now held, though that one had no scope. Just iron sights and faith and 30 years of hard-earned experience. Math does not kill the dear Jake. His father's voice was soft but certain. But math tells you where to aim. Jake had calculated everything that morning with the intensity of a boy trying to impress the man he admired most in the entire world. 300 yards to the white-tail buck, standing at the edge of the clearing, 10 mile per hour, crosswind coming from the west. He had done the arithmetic in his head, factoring in the bullet drop and the wind drift, and he had whispered the answer to his father with the absolute confidence of youth. Hold 18 inches left, 8 feet high. His father had smiled then. It was the kind of smile that said he was proud without having to speak the words out loud, the kind of smile that Jake would remember for the rest of his life. Show me. Jake had fired, and the deer had dropped instantly. A perfect heart shot, clean and quick and merciful. They had walked to it together through the frozen leaves, their boots crunching in the silence of that November morning, and his father had knelt beside the animal with a kind of reverence that Jake did not fully understand until many years later. "You are not a natural shooter, son." His father ran his rough, calloused hand along the deer's still warm flank. "You are something better. You are a calculator." That night, sitting by the fire in their small house on the edge of town, his father had pulled out his own rifle from the First World War, the rifle he had carried through the mud and blood of France. The metal was scratched and worn. The stock was dinged with 100 memories that his father never talked about. "I killed Germans with this at 400 yards. His voice was quiet and distant, as if he were speaking more to the fire than to his son. Iron sights, guesswork. I missed more than I hit. He had looked at Jake then, and there was something in his eyes that the boy did not fully comprehend, a kind of weight, a kind of knowledge that could only come from seeing things that no man should ever have to see. "Imagine what you could do with glass, Jake. Imagine what you could do if you could see them before they saw you." Jake had never forgotten that conversation. Every word was burned into his memory like a brand. And when his father died on Guadalcanal in the late summer of 1942, killed by a Japanese sniper he never saw coming, Jake had made a promise standing over the closed casket at the funeral home in Hickory Corners. He would finish what his father started. He would learn to use the glass. He would become the calculator his father always knew he could be. Now, on Peleliu, with the scope pressed against his eye and the Japanese officer in his crosshair, Jake whispered the same words his father had taught him all those years ago in the Michigan woods. "Patience beats firepower." He exhaled slowly, letting the air out of his lungs until they were almost empty. His finger found the trigger. The metal was smooth and cool against his skin. The trigger on the 1903 Springfield broke like a thin rod of glass. It was crisp, sudden, and terrifyingly light. There was no creep, no warning, just the immediate release of the firing pin spring. The rifle slammed back into Jake's shoulder with shocking violence. It was a sharp, angry kick, far worse than the gas-operated push of a Garand. But Jake did not feel the bruise already forming on his collarbone. He did not feel the pain. He was too busy watching through the scope. This was the moment the infantrymen did not understand. They thought a scope was just a magnifying glass glued to a gun. They did not know about the slide. They did not understand the engineering marvel that made this shot possible. When the rifle fired, the recoil drove the wooden stock backward against Jake's shoulder with tremendous force, but the heavy steel tube of the unertl scope wanted to stay exactly where it was. Basic physics took over. The scope actually slid forward inside its aluminum rings, moving nearly 3 inches along the length of the barrel. It looked like a piston on a steam engine. It was a bizarre, jarring mechanical action that made it look like the gun was falling apart. If Jake had been using a rigidly mounted modern scope, the recoil would have driven the eyepiece straight into his eye socket, hard enough to blind him. But the unertl slid forward away from his face, absorbing the brutal shock and keeping the delicate lenses safe from the violent energy of the 3006 cartridge. Jake kept his eye pressed to the rubber eyepiece. He reached up with his left hand and manually pulled the scope back into battery, sliding it rearward until it clicked solidly into its starting position. It was muscle memory he had practiced 10,000 times on the range at Camp Pendleton. Shoot, slide, reset, repeat. He did not blink. He could not afford to blink even once. The bullet was still in the air, traveling across 800 yards of empty space at impossible speed. At a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, the round covered the first few hundred yards almost instantly. But as it flew, the air grabbed at it like invisible hands trying to slow it down. The drag increased exponentially. Gravity pulled at it, relentlessly bending its path toward the earth. The bullet took 1.4 seconds to cross the 800-yard valley. That might sound like a heartbeat. A blink, nothing at all. But in a gunfight, 1.4 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time to take a full breath. It is enough time to doubt every calculation you have ever made. It is enough time for the target to bend down to tie his boot and ruin everything you have planned. Jake watched the ridge through the magnified circle of light. Time seemed to slow down. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. The Japanese officer was still smiling. He was mid-sentence, his hand raised high above his head to point at the marine lines below, and then the physics equation solved itself. The officer simply collapsed. There was no dramatic flailing, no movie-style backward flip, no theatrical gesture. It looked like someone had suddenly cut all the strings on a marionette. The man just folded in on himself and dropped straight down behind the limestone lip of the ridge. The pink mist that snipers sometimes talked about was not visible at this distance, not even with 8-power magnification. There was just the sudden, jarring absence of the man who had been playing God 10 seconds earlier. The sound of the shot finally rolled back across the valley. A flat, heavy crack that echoed off the coral walls and faded into the thick jungle air. Then silence. Absolute heavy silence that pressed down on everything like a physical weight. The Japanese mortar crew on the reverse slope waited patiently for an order that would never come. The machine gun position to the left stopped firing, confused by the sudden disappearance of their commander. They did not understand what had just happened. They did not know their officer was dead. In the American trench, the Marines who had been mocking Jake 10 minutes earlier were frozen in place like statues. They lowered their binoculars slowly as if moving through thick water. They looked at the ridge where the officer had been standing just moments before. Then they looked at the toy rifle resting on the sandbags with its ridiculous glass pipe catching the harsh Pacific sunlight. Sergeant Carson stood up very slowly, his weathered mouth hanging slightly open. He looked at the impossible distance. Then he looked back at the skinny 20-year-old kid with the mail-order telescope. The mockery evaporated instantly like water dropped on a red-hot stove. It was replaced by a look of confusion that slowly hardened into something close to fear. Not fear of Jake himself, but fear of what Jake represented. The idea that war could be reduced to pure mathematics, that death could be calculated like a simple trigonometry problem, that a man could be erased from existence by numbers written on a forearm in pencil. Jake did not celebrate. He did not look up for acknowledgement or praise from the men around him. He simply reached for the bolt handle with the mechanical efficiency of a factory worker on an assembly line. This was the other significant drawback of the Springfield. It was painfully slow. With a Garand, you just kept pulling the trigger and the rifle did all the work. With this bolt action relic from another era, you had to physically unlock the breech, drag the spent casing out, and manually shove a fresh round home. Jake worked the action with the palm of his right hand. It was a smooth, deliberate motion he had practiced 10,000 times until it became automatic. The empty brass cartridge spun out of the ejection port and pinged against the white coral rock with a sound like a small bell ringing. He drove a fresh round into the chamber from the internal magazine and locked the bolt down with a solid metallic clunk that echoed in the sudden silence. He was ready again, ready to calculate. Ready to kill. Sergeant Carson moved across the trench slowly, no longer laughing, no longer skeptical, no longer treating Jake like a naive college boy playing soldier. He knelt beside him, and when he finally spoke, his voice had completely changed. It was quieter now, respectful, almost reverent. How far was that shot, Mitchell? 800 yards, Sergeant. Carson stared at him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the harsh tropical sunlight. He was processing what he had just witnessed, trying to understand something that violated everything he thought he knew about infantry combat. And you just calculated it in your head. Yes, Sergeant, math does not lie. Carson continued to stare, his mind working through the implications. Then he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes. He shook one cigarette loose and offered it to Jake with a hand that trembled slightly. This was significant, deeply significant. Sergeant Daniel Carson shared his cigarettes with absolutely no one. Not since Tarawa, not since he had smoked his last Lucky Strike with his son on the transport ship the night before the landing, telling the boy stories about Kentucky and promising him they would go fishing together in the Cumberland River when the war was finally over. Jake took the cigarette, though he did not smoke and never had. It was not about the cigarette itself. It was about the gesture. It was about being accepted by a man who had seen more death than any human being should ever have to witness in a single lifetime. Kid, Carson said quietly, lighting both cigarettes with a battered Zippo that had clearly seen better days. I was wrong about you. Jake nodded once, accepting the apology that was buried in those simple words. He took a single drag of the cigarette, immediately coughed from the harsh smoke, and set it down carefully on the sandbag. His eyes never left the scope for more than a few seconds. 3 minutes later, a Japanese NCO crawled up to the ridge to check on the fallen officer. He was careful, well-trained. He stayed low, keeping his head down, moving with the practiced caution of a veteran soldier who had survived this long by never taking unnecessary risks. But he made one critical mistake. He stopped to look through the dead officer's binoculars, trying to locate the American positions and understand what had just happened to his commander. He exposed his head and shoulders for exactly 5 seconds. Jake was already waiting, patient, calm, ready. He had pre-aimed at the exact spot where the officer had fallen. The crosshair was hovering over the white limestone, steady and unmoving. When the helmet appeared above the ridgeline, Jake did not have to calculate anything new. He did not have to adjust for wind or temperature or distance. The math was already done. He just had to squeeze. He squeezed the glass rod trigger with steady, even pressure. The second shot cracked through the humid Pacific air. The recoil slide kicked back violently. The scope reset automatically under Jake's experienced hand. The NCO did not even hear the sound that killed him. The heavy .30 caliber bullet punched through his helmet like it was made of paper and knocked him backward off the ridge like a child's toy swept away by an angry hand. 2 shots, 2 kills, both at half a mile, both with mathematical precision. This time, the reaction in the American trench was completely different. Sergeant Carson did not stare in confusion or disbelief. He immediately scrambled over the jagged rocks and positioned himself beside Jake like a bodyguard protecting the President of the United States. He barked sharp orders at the other Marines to keep their heads down, to not draw fire toward Jake's position, to stay low and stay quiet and stay alive. He offered Jake his canteen. He offered him a stick of Wrigley's spearmint gum from his personal stash. Suddenly, the college boy with the mail-order toy had become the most valuable asset in the entire platoon, maybe the entire battalion. Carson began pointing out targets like a man directing traffic at a busy intersection, a machine gun nest dug into a cave mouth at 600 yards, a sniper hide partially concealed in a burned breadfruit tree at 500 yards, a mortar team setting up behind a coral ridge at 700. He was feeding information to the calculator, and the calculator was solving problems that artillery could not reach and that conventional infantry could never touch. Jake went to work with cold efficiency. For the next hour, he conducted a brutal clinic in long-range destruction. He eliminated 6 more confirmed targets, a machine gunner silhouetted against a cave entrance at 650 yards, 2 officers conferring behind what they thought was adequate cover at 720 yards, a sniper in a tree who made the fatal mistake of shifting position at 580 yards, a mortar crew at 700 yards. He targeted the things the other Marines could not see and could not hit. He put a round through the narrow aperture of a concrete bunker, killing the gunner inside without ever seeing more than a dark shadow. He shot the steel leg of a mortar tripod from 650 yards, toppling the entire weapon system and scattering the crew in confusion. He was not just killing individual men anymore. He was systematically dismantling their entire defensive network, one calculated shot at a time. He was destroying their ability to coordinate, their ability to communicate, their ability to function as a cohesive military unit. The unearthly scope, with its absurd length and seemingly fragile mounts, was proving to be the perfect tool for the static grinding warfare of Peleliu. The high magnification allowed him to see deep into the shadows of the limestone caves, to spot the brief muzzle flash of a hidden rifle, to pick out the edge of carefully arranged camouflage netting that blended almost perfectly with the jungle backdrop. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jake had fired 23 rounds, 8 confirmed kills, multiple weapon systems destroyed, an entire defensive sector rendered combat ineffective. The toy rifle was no longer a joke. The mail-order scope was no longer a circus attraction. The fragile glass pipe that supposedly had no business in a real war had just announced itself to the enemy with brutal clarity, and the enemy was learning very quickly to be afraid of the man they would soon call Akuma no Magain, the devil with glasses. The morning of September 16th arrived with the same suffocating heat, but the battlefield had changed in ways that could not be measured with a thermometer or marked on a map. Word had spread through the Marine lines like electricity through copper wire. There was a shooter in the Umerbrogel pocket who could reach out and touch the enemy at distances that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics. The men who had laughed at Jake Mitchell 24 hours earlier now treated him like a priest carrying holy relics. They spoke his name in hushed, reverent tones. They watched him walk past with a mixture of awe and something close to fear, but Jake felt no different than he had the day before. He woke in the gray, pre-dawn darkness with the same knot twisting in his stomach, the same tremor in his hands that only steadied when he wrapped his fingers around the worn walnut stalk of the Springfield. He had killed 8 men yesterday, 8 confirmed kills, probably more that he could not verify because they had fallen behind cover or crawled away to die in the darkness of the caves. The numbers should have meant something. They should have felt significant, but they did not. They felt hollow and distant, like stones dropped into a deep well where you never hear them hit bottom. What mattered, the only thing that truly mattered, was that the mortars had stopped falling on his friends. Sergeant Carson appeared beside him in the gray light, carrying a dented canteen cup filled with coffee that looked like motor oil and probably tasted worse. He was moving differently now, more carefully, the way you move around something valuable that might break if handled roughly. Battalion wants you to take a look at a bunker complex. Carson spread a rain-damaged map across an ammunition crate using his thumb to hold down one curling corner. Grid 447229. Intelligence thinks it is a command post. Jake took the coffee and studied the map in the growing light. The bunker was marked with a red circle. It sat 900 yards away, built into the reverse slope of a ridge that the Marines could not approach without walking directly into a meat grinder of interlocking machine gun fire. 900 yards, Jake said quietly, his voice flat as he ran the calculations in his head with the same casual ease most men use to add simple numbers. Bullet drop is about 230 inches. That is just over 19 feet. Carson stared at him as if he had just announced he could fly to the moon by flapping his arms. You can hit something at 900 yards. The manual says effective range is 900 yards for a point target. Jake's voice remained calm, almost detached. I have never tried it in actual combat, only on the range. Can you do it? Jake studied the distant ridge through his scope. The bunker was barely visible to the naked eye, just a dark slash in the white coral that could easily be mistaken for a natural shadow, but with the 8-power magnification he could make out specific details. The reinforced gun port, the slight discoloration where fresh sandbags had been stacked, the edge of a camouflage net, movement in the shadows behind the firing position. Give me 40 minutes to calculate the shot properly. He set up on a completely different position nearly 100 yards from where he had fired yesterday. The Japanese were not stupid. They would be looking for him now. They would be searching for the sniper who had killed their officers and systematically dismantled their defensive positions with surgical precision. Jake built a new hide using chunks of broken coral and a piece of torn shelter, half creating deep shadows that would hide his muzzle flash from observers on the distant ridgeline. He carefully stacked sandbags to support the long rifle, making absolutely certain the inertial tube had proper clearance so it would not strike anything during the violent recoil cycle. Then he went to work with his notebook and pencil, 900 yards. Temperature already climbing past 95 degrees, humidity near complete saturation, wind quartering from the southeast at approximately 7 miles per hour, though it was gusty and unpredictable. He would need to account for all of it. He wrote the numbers on his forearm again in small, precise script. He was running out of clean skin. Both arms were covered now with calculations from yesterday fading, but still visible like primitive tattoos. Carson watched him work in silence. He no longer questioned or doubted. He simply observed with the quiet fascination of a man watching something he does not fully understand but knows is important. You really do treat this like a pure math problem. It is a math problem, Sergeant. Gravity is a constant that never changes. Wind is a variable that shifts. Temperature affects air density, but the math does not care if I am scared or confident. It simply is. Are you scared? Jake looked up from his calculations. His face was streaked with white coral dust that had mixed with sweat to form pale mud. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and constant strain, but there was something else there too, something hard and cold that had not been there before Palaelu. Every single time I pulled the trigger. Jake settled in behind the rifle and began the slow, patient process of stalking a target he could barely see with the naked eye. Through the scope, the bunker entrance gradually became clear as the light improved. He could see the sandbags stacked in a careful L shape. He could see the reinforced firing port cut through thick concrete. He could see the dull glint of metal where a machine gun barrel protruded through the narrow opening. He waited for 30 minutes, barely breathing, barely moving. Time seemed to slow down and thicken like honey. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, turning the air into something you had to push through to breathe. Sweat ran into his eyes, and he blinked it away with slow, careful movements. The coral dug into his elbows through his thin uniform shirt, but he ignored the pain. Carson sat beside him, patient as stone, occasionally chewing tobacco and spitting into an empty C ration can. Then a figure appeared in the bunker entrance. Just for a moment. A brief flash of movement. An officer, judging by the cut of the uniform, he was shouting orders to someone inside the bunker, gesturing sharply with a leather map case clutched in his right hand. His face was visible for perhaps 3 seconds before he turned to go back inside. Jake had already dialed in the elevation hours ago. 28 clicks up on the scope's adjustment knob. Wind correction of 3 clicks right to account for the quartering breeze. He placed the crosshair on a point in empty space, approximately 18 feet above where the officer's head had been moments before. He was aiming at pure sky, at nothing but air and faith. At a point in space that existed only in his calculations, he exhaled very slowly, letting half his breath escape and holding the rest. Everything outside the narrow circle of magnified glass ceased to exist. The war, the heat, the coral digging into his flesh, the men watching him, everything narrowed down to a single mathematical point where theory would either become reality or fail completely. The officer reappeared in the bunker entrance, still shouting orders, still gesturing with the map case, still completely unaware that death was being calculated 900 yards away. Jake squeezed the trigger with steady, even pressure. The Springfield roared, the familiar violent recoil, the scope sliding forward and back. Jake worked the bolt, automatically muscle memory taking over, and kept his eye pressed to the rubber eyepiece. Through the glass he watched as the officer suddenly stumbled backward into the darkness of the bunker like a man who had been struck by an invisible fist. The map case flew from his hand and landed in the white coral outside the entrance. 2 seconds of absolute silence passed. Then the bunker complex erupted with chaotic activity. Men poured out of the entrance like ants from a disturbed hill. They were confused, disorganized, leaderless. Their hands were empty of weapons. They looked around frantically, trying to understand what had just happened to their commander. And then something occurred that Jake had not expected, something that would change the entire dynamic of the battle. A white flag appeared, a piece of torn cloth tied hastily to a rifle barrel, waving frantically from the bunker entrance like a desperate signal. Carson grabbed the radio handset so fast he nearly dropped it. Actual, this is Carson. Enemy position grid 447229 is showing white flag. I repeat, white flag, request instructions. Over. The radio crackled back immediately. The voice on the other end sounded as disbelieving as Carson felt. Verify and hold position, sending patrol to accept surrender. Over. Over the next 20 minutes, 47 Japanese soldiers emerged from that bunker complex with their hands raised high above their heads in surrender. 47 men who had been trained since childhood. That surrender was the ultimate dishonor. 47 men who would have fought to the absolute death under normal circumstances, all of them walking out into the harsh sunlight because their commander was gone, erased by a bullet that had dropped from the sky at such a steep angle they initially thought it was artillery fire. A young Marine lieutenant arrived at Jake's position an hour later. He looked maybe 23 years old at most, but his eyes were much older, the eyes of a man who had aged a full decade in the past 3 weeks. Corporal Mitchell? The lieutenant's voice was tight with something between respect and disbelief. The prisoners say their commander was killed by a sniper. They thought it was artillery at first because the angle was so steep. He paused, looking at the rifle with its massive glass tube. How far was that shot? 900 yards, sir. The lieutenant shook his head very slowly, as if trying to dislodge water from his ears. That is not possible. The manual says maximum effective range is 900 yards, but nobody actually makes those shots. Not in combat, not for real. Jake said nothing, the rifle still resting on the sandbags with the inertial scope, catching the harsh Pacific sunlight, spoke for itself more eloquently than any words could. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that Jake had not anticipated and did not want. A Marine Corps photographer materialized at his position carrying a battered speed graphic camera that looked like it had been through hell and somehow survived. He was thin as a rail, maybe 30 years old, with wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose in the oppressive humidity. Corporal Mitchell, I am supposed to document the specialized weapon systems being used in combat. He looked at the Springfield with obvious confusion. His expression suggested he had been expecting something far more impressive. Is this it? This is the rifle everyone is talking about, Carson laughed. It was a deep rumbling sound that started in his chest. That is it, friend. The whole weapon system. One rifle, one calculator, one very patient kid from Michigan. The photographer set up his shot, positioning Jake behind the rifle for the standard posed photograph that would appear in some division newsletter that probably nobody would ever read. Jake settled reluctantly behind the scope, uncomfortable with the attention, uncomfortable with being singled out when so many better men had died. Through the magnified lens, he could see the ridge where the Japanese officer had fallen yesterday morning. Already there were engineers working to rebuild the defensive positions, dragging fresh sandbags, repositioning machine guns. War did not pause for photographs. War did not care about your moment of recognition or glory. The camera shutter clicked with a sharp mechanical sound. The photographer scribbled notes on a small pad. This will be in the division newsletter next week. Marine sniper with experimental long-range optics. That okay with you, Corporal? No names, Jake said quietly, his eye still pressed to the scope, still watching the distant ridge. Just show the rifle. Why not? You are a genuine hero. You just forced 47 enemy soldiers to surrender with a single shot. Jake looked past the photographer at the neat rows of white crosses being methodically pounded into the hard coral below the ridge. Each cross marking a Marine who would never go home to his family, each one representing someone's son or brother or father or husband. Heroes are the ones who did not make it back, sir. I am just doing math. Anyone can do math if they pay attention. The photographer left, looking confused and perhaps slightly disappointed that his hero was not more heroic. Carson offered Jake a canteen of warm water. You know they're going to write about you anyway, kid. You cannot stop that. Then let them write about the rifle. Let them write about the scope, but the rifle cannot read letters from widows. The rifle does not have to live with what I am doing out here. But the photograph and the mass surrender had consequences that Jake could not have anticipated and could not control. That same afternoon, a Marine interpreter who spoke fluent Japanese spent 2 hours questioning the prisoners who had walked out of the bunker complex. He came back to battalion headquarters with news that spread through the command structure faster than any radio transmission ever could. The Japanese had given Jake a name, Akuma no Magan, the devil with glasses, and there was a formal reward posted, 1,000 yen, for any information leading to the sniper's exact position. It was more money than most Japanese soldiers would see in an entire year of military service, more money than some of their families had ever possessed. Carson took the news badly. His weathered face went pale under the layers of coral dust and old sweat. He grabbed Jake by both shoulders hard enough to leave dark bruises that would last for weeks. They are hunting you specifically now, kid. Not just shooting at Americans, hunting you. We need to move you constantly, different positions every time. You never shoot from the same spot twice. You understand what I am telling you? I understand, Sergeant. Because this is not deer hunting back in Michigan anymore. This is not target practice at some safe range in California. They are going to send everything they have to kill you specifically. Counter snipers, artillery, maybe even aircraft if they can manage it. As if the universe wanted to prove Carson's point immediately, the afternoon air suddenly filled with a new sound, a deep rhythmic thumping that made the ground vibrate under their feet like the heartbeat of something massive and angry. Carson's face went from pale to absolutely white. Get down right now. Before Jake could move or even fully process the warning, the ridge directly above their position erupted with sustained heavy machine gun fire, but this was not the familiar sound of a standard infantry weapon. This was something much heavier, much more deliberate, much more deadly. A Type 92 heavy machine gun firing 7mm rounds from a carefully concealed position somewhere on the second ridgeline, somewhere more than 1,000 yards away in the dense jungle. The heavy rounds walked methodically across the valley floor like a giant taking careful steps. Each impact threw up massive geysers of pulverized white coral that looked like small explosions. They were walking the fire in a deliberate pattern directly toward Jake's last known firing position, trying to kill him with overwhelming volume and sustained suppression. Jake and Carson threw themselves flat and pressed their bodies hard into the bottom of the trench as the entire world exploded around them. Razor-sharp splinters of coral whistled overhead like angry wasps made of stone. The concussion from each impact felt like being repeatedly punched in the chest by an invisible fist that was trying to stop your heart. When the firing finally stopped after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 30 seconds, Jake's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear Carson shouting at him from 2 feet away. "We have to move right now. They have this position completely dialed in." But Jake had seen something critically important during those few seconds of absolute terror, something most men would have missed while trying desperately not to die: the muzzle flash, a dark slash in the thick jungle canopy on the far ridge, maybe 100 yards away, maybe more. The heavy gun crew had revealed their exact position while trying to kill him. He crawled back to his rifle on his hands and knees, checking it frantically. The scope was covered in fine white dust, but the glass underneath was intact. The delicate mounts were still tight and true. He blew the dust off the lenses with short, controlled breaths and carefully swung the heavy rifle toward the second ridgeline. "Mitchell, what in God's name are you doing? We need to move immediately." "That gun is at least 1,000 yards out, Sergeant. Probably closer to 100. "Exactly. It is completely out of effective range. We need to get out of here before they fire again." Jake settled the rifle back onto the sandbags with hands that were shaking, but not from fear, from something else entirely, a kind of cold mathematical certainty that he had learned from his father during those frozen Michigan mornings, the absolute certainty that comes from trusting numbers even when every survival instinct is screaming at you to run. "The manual says maximum effective range is 900 yards, Jake said quietly, his voice eerily calm, "but the bullet does not know what the manual says. The bullet only knows physics." Carson stared at him as if he had completely lost his mind. "You are not seriously considering this. They just tried to kill both of us." "I know exactly where they are now. They showed me." "Jake." It was only the second time Carson had used his first name. "That is a suicide shot. The bullet will drop more than 30 feet. You will be aiming at empty clouds. At nothing." "I know what I will be aiming at, Sergeant." Jake peered through the scope and carefully found the dark slash in the jungle canopy where the muzzle flash had originated. He could barely see the position even with 8-power magnification, just a hint of metal glinting in dappled sunlight, the suggestion of sandbags, the ghost of a gun barrel. The problem was fundamental. Even with maximum elevation adjustment on the scope, he simply could not compensate mathematically for a 100-yard shot. The numbers did not work within the mechanical limits of the equipment. He would have to use pure Kentucky windage, holding the crosshair impossibly high above the target and trusting his instinct and experience to judge the correct hold. Guessing the drop based on feel and faith and mathematics that existed only in his mind, he aimed at a small patch of blue sky visible through the jungle canopy, a point in space approximately 20 feet above where he thought the gun position was hidden. He was aiming at absolutely nothing, at pure air, at the same kind of faith his father had trusted when he aimed at Germans with primitive iron sights in a completely different war on a completely different continent in what felt like a different lifetime. Jake exhaled very slowly. He forced himself to trust the math that existed only in his head. He trusted the glass pipe that everyone had said was a useless toy. He squeezed the trigger with steady, even pressure. The rifle kicked viciously against his shoulder. The scope slid forward with brutal force and snapped back. Jake pulled it into battery and desperately tried to keep his eye on the distant jungle, but the violent recoil had completely destroyed his sight picture. By the time he got the scope settled and refocused, the critical moment had already passed. He could only see the green canopy swaying gently in the tropical breeze. He waited for the inevitable return fire, waited for the heavy gun to tear their position into shredded meat and broken bones, waited for death to arrive in the form of 7.7 millimeter rounds traveling faster than sound. 1 second passed in absolute silence, then 2, then 5, then 10. Nothing. The rhythmic thumping of the Japanese heavy machine gun did not return. The valley remained eerily quiet. A sudden wild cheer erupted from PFC Bobby Chen, the young 18-year-old spotter from San Francisco who had been watching through binoculars with wide, terrified eyes. He started jumping up and down in the trench like an excited child. "You hit them. I saw the whole thing. The gunner just collapsed right over the gun." Carson was pounding Jake on the back hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs, shouting that he had seen the gun crew scatter in absolute panic, that he had seen at least one body fall, that the round had dropped out of the sky at such an impossibly steep angle it must have looked like artillery to anyone watching. It was a 1 in a million shot, maybe 1 in 10 million. It was pure luck married to mathematics in a way that should not have been possible. But in war, luck counts for just as much as skill, and sometimes the only thing separating the living from the dead is a tiny fraction of an inch and the raw courage to trust your calculations when every instinct screams at you to run away. Jake did not celebrate. He could not. He slumped back against the trench wall, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The unertl scope was completely covered in thick soot and fine coral dust. He wiped the precious lenses with trembling fingers, checking obsessively for the hairline cracks that would end everything. None. The glass remained perfect. Impossibly miraculously perfect. The fragile toy had somehow survived another test that should have destroyed it. But Jake understood something the others did not. The silence was not victory. It was a trap waiting to spring. He had been operating from positions in the same general area for nearly 2 hours. He had fired more than 20 rounds. He had systematically killed officers and gunners and dismantled their carefully prepared defensive positions with surgical precision. He had become the single biggest problem on the entire battlefield. And on Peleliu, when you became that kind of problem, the Japanese did not just send more infantry or more machine guns. They sent someone who truly understood the nature of the problem you represented. They sent a calculator to hunt another calculator. The shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Jake was methodically scanning the ridgeline for his next target when the coral exploded exactly 6 inches from his head. A razor-sharp fragment sliced cleanly across his right cheek, opening a gash that immediately began streaming hot blood down his neck and soaking into his already filthy collar. The sound was completely different from anything he had heard before. Sharper, flatter, more precise. Not the heavy crack of a standard Type 99 Arisaka rifle, but something else entirely. Something designed specifically for this kind of work. Carson grabbed Jake by the shoulder and physically hauled him down below the protective lip of the trench with surprising strength for a man his age. "Sniper! Counter! Sniper! Get down and stay down!" Corporal Rodriguez, still manning his position 20 feet away, shouted across the broken coral. His voice was tight with fear. That came from the second ridge, at least 800 yards out, maybe more. Jake pressed his hand against the bleeding wound on his face and felt his heart hammering so hard in his chest he thought his ribs might crack. For the first time since he had arrived on this hellish island, someone had shot at him with the clear and deliberate intention of killing him specifically. Not random fire, not suppression, not blind luck. Someone had carefully calculated his exact position. Someone had done the mathematics. Someone had squeezed a trigger with Jake Mitchell's name written on the bullet. Someone who thought exactly like him. He crawled back to his rifle despite Carson's increasingly frantic protests and scanned the second ridgeline through the scope with desperate intensity. Nothing visible. Whoever had just tried to kill him had already moved or melted back into the thick jungle, but they had left behind a calling card written in precision and patience and cold mathematical certainty. "We need to move immediately," Carson said with urgent force. Right now, that shot was way too close. "He missed," Jake said quietly, almost to himself. "Next time he will not miss. That is how this works. He learns from the miss. He adjusts. He gets closer each time until he does not miss anymore." But Jake was already thinking 3 moves ahead, like a chess player anticipating his opponent's strategy. Whoever had just shot at him was not a regular infantry soldier. He was specifically trained for this work. He was disciplined. He understood ballistics and windage and temperature effects and all the subtle variables that turned shooting into a science. He was a counter sniper, and that meant Jake had finally met his match. Far away on that distant ridge, hidden in a carefully constructed hide that blended perfectly with the surrounding jungle, Captain Takeshi Yamamoto lowered his Type 97 sniper rifle and studied the American position through his inferior 2.5 power scope with intense concentration. Yamamoto was 28 years old, a graduate of Tokyo University with an advanced degree in pure mathematics. Before the war, he had been a professor teaching calculus and differential equations to engineering students who would never use most of what they learned. When Japan desperately needed trained snipers, they had sent him to the Imperial Army Sniper School, where he quickly discovered that precision shooting was nothing more than applied mathematics with dramatically higher stakes. He had been watching the American sniper work for 2 full days now, studying his methods with academic interest, trying to calculate his next position, attempting to predict his patterns. The American was exceptionally good, better than good. He understood trajectory and wind drift and bullet drop. He made shots that should have been mathematically impossible given the equipment limitations, but he had one critical weakness that Yamamoto had identified: his scope. Even from 850 yards away, Yamamoto could see that massive tube mounted high above the receiver. It had to be at least 8 power magnification, possibly even 10. The American could see targets with crystal clarity that Yamamoto could barely identify as human shapes with his vastly inferior 2.5 power Type 97 scope. But that tremendous advantage came with a corresponding disadvantage. The American had an extremely narrow field of view. He could only see what was directly in front of the crosshair. Everything else disappeared completely into the tunnel vision created by high magnification. Yamamoto had missed his carefully calculated first shot by perhaps 4 inches. The American had shifted position at the last possible moment, some deeply buried animal instinct warning him of immediate danger. But now, Yamamoto had collected the critical data he needed. He knew the exact range, he knew the wind patterns, he knew how the American moved and thought. He began planning his next attempt with the methodical patience of a mathematician solving a complex proof. Back in the American lines, Jake absolutely refused to move, despite Carson's increasingly desperate orders. He understood instinctively what the enemy sniper was doing right now, calculating, planning, setting up the geometry for the next shot. If Jake moved immediately, he would surrender the initiative completely. He would transform from hunter into prey. Sergeant, I need you to trust me on this. Kid, trusting you is precisely how I have managed to keep you alive this long. Then trust me now. That sniper missed because I saw something at the very last second. A shadow in the wrong place, a color that did not quite match, something my brain recognized as dangerous before I consciously knew what it was. And what if your brain is wrong the next time? Then you get to say I told you so at my funeral. Carson stared at him for a long, tense moment. Then he spat a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the white coral and grabbed his rifle with both hands. Fine, but I am spotting for you full time now, and if I see so much as a single leaf move wrong on that ridge, we are both getting out of here immediately. That is not a request, that is an order. Understood, Sergeant. For the next full hour, Jake and the invisible enemy sniper played an extraordinarily deadly game of chess across 850 yards of torn jungle and blasted coral. Neither could see the other clearly. Both knew with absolute certainty that the other was there, calculating, planning, waiting with infinite patience for a single mistake that would end everything. Yamamoto carefully set an elaborate trap. He ordered his men to construct a realistic dummy target exactly 50 yards to the left of his actual firing position, a complete Japanese uniform stuffed with rice straw propped up on a wooden stick behind a convincing pile of sandbags. From significant distance, it would appear to be an officer casually observing the battlefield through binoculars. Then he settled into his hide and trained his Type 97 rifle on the area where he confidently expected the American sniper to reveal himself. Through his scope, Jake methodically scanned the distant ridge with the systematic patience his father had taught him during those frozen Michigan deer hunts. He spotted the Japanese officer almost immediately. The uniform was far too clean for someone who had been in combat for weeks. The posture was unnaturally stiff and rigid. The entire scene felt fundamentally wrong, like a painting where the perspective was subtly incorrect in ways your conscious mind could not quite identify. If he were setting a trap to kill another sniper, this is exactly what he would do. Exactly. See that officer on Ridge 3? Carson asked, peering through his binoculars. Standing near that burnt palm tree. I see him clearly. Perfect shot. Maybe 700 yards, easy range for you now. It is a dummy target, a decoy. Carson lowered the binoculars and looked at Jake with surprise. How can you possibly know that? Because that is precisely what I would do in his position. Put up a convincing decoy, wait patiently for me to take the shot, watch carefully for my muzzle flash, then shoot me while I am working the bolt and cannot move. Jake slowly moved his crosshair away from the obvious dummy target and began systematically scanning the surrounding area with methodical care, looking for shadows that were too uniformly dark, rocks that were the wrong subtle color, vegetation that was arranged too deliberately in patterns nature would never create. There, approximately 50 yards to the left of the dummy, a small natural crevice in the weathered coral, barely visible even with magnification. But the shadow pooled inside was darker than it should be, and there was a perfectly straight line visible where nature would have produced only irregular curves. He could just barely make out the edge of a rifle barrel protruding slightly from the darkness. Found you, Jake whispered so quietly that even Carson sitting right beside him could barely hear. Through his own scope, Yamamoto suddenly saw the massive American scope swing directly toward his position. The huge tube caught the bright sunlight for just a brief fraction of a second, creating a telltale glint. The American had seen completely through his carefully prepared trap. Both snipers realized simultaneously that they were now looking directly at each other across nearly 900 yards of empty tropical air. Both understood with perfect clarity that whoever fired first would immediately give away their exact position with muzzle flash and sound. But waiting also carried enormous risk because the other might shoot first. It was a classic prisoner's dilemma written in Mathematics and Imminent Death. Jake carefully placed his crosshair on the dark shadow where he calculated the enemy sniper's head should be positioned. His finger began applying steady pressure to the trigger. Yamamoto placed his crosshair on the massive American scope that glinted like a mirror in the harsh sunlight. His finger tightened on his own trigger with equal determination. They fired within 0.3 of a second of each other. The two rifle reports echoed across the valley so close together in time, they sounded almost like one continuous sharp crack. Jake's bullet struck the coral formation exactly 2 inches to the left of Yamamoto's head, spraying the Japanese sniper's face with stinging limestone fragments that cut his skin and temporarily filled his eyes with blinding white dust. Yamamoto's bullet hit the sandbag approximately 4 inches to the right of Jake's exposed shoulder, missing him by the width of an average man's hand. Both men worked their bolt actions with frantic speed. Jake fired again, perhaps half a second faster. This time he watched through his scope as the enemy rifle was violently knocked backward into the darkness of the cave, immediately followed by a distinct spray of dark blood across the white rock face. He had hit Yamamoto somewhere in the upper body, probably the shoulder, not immediately fatal, but absolutely fight-ending. Through the magnified glass, Jake watched as the Japanese sniper crawled awkwardly deeper into his concealed hide, dragging his clearly wounded arm behind him, retreating into the relative safety of the extensive cave system that honeycombed the ridge. The duel of calculators was finished. Mathematics had decided the final outcome exactly as it always did. The difference between continued life and sudden death had been measured in 0.3 of a second and approximately 2 inches. The margin of error in war is measured in fractions so small they are almost incomprehensible to the human mind. Carson slowly released a breath he felt like he had been holding for an entire hour. Is he dead? Wounded. Shoulder, I think. He is completely out of the fight now. Good enough for me. But before either man could fully process what had just happened, the ground began to shake with a completely different kind of vibration. Something mechanical, something heavy, something that made your teeth rattle and your stomach turn over. Carson's weathered face went from tan to pale gray in an instant. Tanks. They are sending armor. 2 Type 95 light tanks came grinding around the bend in the ridge road like mechanical demons emerging from hell itself. They were ugly, angular machines painted in faded yellow and brown camouflage that did nothing to hide their brutal purpose. Small compared to the massive American Sherman tanks, but against infantry with no anti-tank weapons, they were absolutely unstoppable. Their 37mm main guns swiveled mechanically searching for targets. Their hull-mounted machine guns sprayed the American lines with sustained hatred. The infantry opened fire with everything they possessed. M1 Garands pinged harmlessly off thick steel armor like thrown pebbles. Fragmentation grenades exploded uselessly against the heavy tracks. The tanks completely ignored the small arms fire and kept advancing with terrible mechanical inevitability. They were rolling directly toward the gap in the defensive lines, clearly intent on breaking through and overrunning the vulnerable command post. Jake felt ice water replace the blood in his stomach. His rifle was completely useless here. A .30 caliber bullet against hardened tank armor was like throwing sand at a locomotive. He could possibly hit the driver's narrow vision slit, but that was a tiny rectangle of extremely thick glass, barely 2 inches wide, and both tanks were bouncing violently over the uneven terrain. Carson was screaming desperately for a bazooka team, but the bazookas were gone, out of ammunition or destroyed or buried with their dead operators somewhere in the endless coral. Jake watched the lead tank carefully. It was not completely buttoned up. The commander's hatch was standing open. A Japanese officer was visible from the chest up, standing in the turret and shouting into a radio headset. It was the same fatal arrogance the officers on the ridge had displayed. They genuinely believed the American infantry was completely suppressed and broken. They did not think anyone would be insane enough to take a shot at a moving tank with a bolt-action rifle designed for shooting stationary targets. Jake centered the crosshair on the tank commander's exposed head. The immediate problem was violent movement. The tank was bouncing heavily over extremely uneven ground, lurching in unpredictable patterns. The commander's head bobbed up and down like a cork floating in rough water. Every time Jake tried to track him, the narrow field of view of the high-power scope lost the target completely. He did something that made Carson gasp audibly. He reached up and carefully adjusted the magnification ring on the unertl scope, deliberately turning it down to reduce the power. The magnified image got noticeably smaller, but the field of view widened dramatically. Now he could see the entire tank in context. He could observe the rhythm of the violent bounce. Up, down, the suspension compressing heavily and then rebounding. He had to time the shot perfectly. Fire at the precise top of the bounce. That split second where the suspension hung momentarily in the air before crashing back down, Jake led the moving tank, placing the vertical crosshair approximately 2 feet in front of the commander's face. He waited with forced patience as the tank climbed over a large pile of rubble. The nose pitched up sharply. The commander rose directly into the crosshair. Jake fired. The bullet struck the commander in the side of the helmet with devastating force. The man disappeared into the turret instantly as if yanked down by an invisible cable. The tank immediately swerved violently to the left, crashing hard into a coral wall. The engine sputtered, coughed black smoke, and died. It sat there smoking and disabled. Finished. The second tank did not stop or slow down. It roared past its crippled partner, actually accelerating toward the Marine defensive lines. This commander had learned from watching his partner die. His hatch was sealed tight, completely buttoned up. A rolling steel coffin that was impossible to penetrate. 400 yards and closing fast. Jake scanned desperately for any weakness. The armor was impenetrable to his rifle. The tracks were moving far too fast to hit reliably. Then he saw something most men would never have noticed. The gunner's vision optic, a small circle of glass mounted next to the main gun barrel, maybe the size of a tea saucer. If he could shatter that glass, the gunner would be completely blind. The tank was 300 yards away when the main gun fired. The heavy shell exploded against the trench wall just 10 feet from Jake's position, showering him with dirt and burning hot shrapnel. Blood began trickling from his nose from the concussion pressure. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and settled back behind the rifle with grim determination. He placed the crosshair on the tiny glass circle and squeezed with steady pressure. The shot sparked brightly off the turret armor. A miss by perhaps 3 inches. Jake worked the bolt frantically. The tank was 200 yards away now. Machine gun rounds were chewing up the sandbags all around his position. Carson was firing his Thompson submachine gun in a completely useless gesture of pure defiance. Jake fired again. This time, white dust puffed exactly on the optic. The glass shattered into fragments. The turret immediately stopped its methodical rotation. The main gun froze, pointing uselessly to the right. Without functioning gun sights, the tank was reduced to nothing more than a blind battering ram. Marines instantly swarmed it from multiple directions, jamming grenades into vision slits, throwing a heavy satchel charge onto the engine deck. The massive explosion rocked the entire valley. The second tank ground to a complete halt, burning fiercely. Jake collapsed back against the trench wall. His entire body was trembling uncontrollably. The inertial scope was covered in thick black soot, but incredibly, the glass remained unbroken. The fragile toy had just helped kill 2 tanks. But the destruction of both tanks enraged the Japanese defenders in a way that rifle fire never could. Jake had crossed an invisible psychological line. He had moved from mere nuisance to genuine existential threat, from irritating sniper to something the enemy had no tactical answer for. And when an army has no tactical answer, it resorts to the oldest, most brutal solution in all of warfare: overwhelming human force. The attack began with a sound that turned blood into ice water and made hardened veterans feel genuine primal fear, a sound that had terrified Marines on every Pacific island. Tenno Heika Banzai. The cry rose from the jungle floor like the voice of 1,000 demons screaming in unison. It started as a distant whisper, then built and grew to a deafening roar that echoed off the coral ridges and seemed to shake the very air. 10,000 voices screaming. Long live the Emperor! Carson's face went absolutely white. He had heard this terrible sound before on other islands. He knew exactly what it meant. Banzai charge, fixed bayonets, human wave attack. The Marines frantically locked their long steel bayonets onto the ends of their M1 Garands. They braced themselves against the trench walls. They knew what was coming: hand-to-hand combat. Brutal, intimate, and absolutely bloody. Jake looked down at his Springfield rifle. It had a bayonet lug, but the thought of mounting a blade on a rifle with a 2-foot precision scope was completely insane. The vibration and impact of stabbing someone would instantly shatter the delicate optics. The rifle was too long, too heavy, too fragile for what was about to happen. He made a decision that felt like cutting off his own arm. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wrench he carried for the scope mounts. With trembling fingers, he carefully loosened the thumb screws that held his lifeline in place. He slid the unertile scope off the rifle, feeling the substantial weight of it in his hands. 24 inches of precision glass and steel that had kept him alive for 2 days. He did not just carelessly toss it aside. He wrapped it in the canvas case with the same gentle care a mother might use wrapping a newborn infant. Then he shoved it deep under the heavy sandbags at the very bottom of the trench, burying it like precious treasure. Carson watched him, understanding completely. "You going to be okay without it?" Jake stood up slowly. He was just a rifleman now, a simple bolt-action rifle with primitive iron sights and 5 rounds in the magazine. He looked at Carson and nodded with more confidence than he felt. "My father fought the Germans without glass. I can do this too." The first wave of Japanese soldiers hit the defensive wire at a full dead run. The machine guns tore them apart with brutal efficiency, but more came behind, climbing over the bodies of the fallen. They were 50 yards away, then 30, then 10. Jake fired his iron-sighted rifle as fast as he could, physically work the bolt. He dropped a charging man at 20 yards, another at 10. The rifle cracked against his shoulder again and again. Then the human wave crashed directly into the trench like a tsunami of flesh and steel. A Japanese soldier vaulted over the parapet and landed directly on top of Jake with his full body weight. The impact drove all the air from Jake's lungs. The soldier raised his rifle high to drive the bayonet straight down through Jake's chest. Jake brought the wooden stock of the Springfield up with desperate animal strength, smashing it hard into the man's jaw. The wood cracked audibly. The soldier fell backward. Jake scrambled to his feet, working the bolt with frantic speed. He fired from the hip at point-blank range, the muzzle blast singing the enemy's uniform. The trench transformed into an absolute slaughterhouse. Men grappled in the mud, stabbing, gouging, screaming. There was no strategy here, no careful calculations, just the oldest, most primitive equation humans have ever known: kill or be killed. Jake fought with pure animal desperation. He used the rifle as a club when there was no time to reload. He used his trench knife, a 6-inch blade that his father had carried through the trenches of France in 1918. He fought until his arms felt like dead weight and his lungs burned with each gasping breath. Carson stayed close throughout the big sergeant, fighting like a demon possessed, protecting Jake's exposed flanks. They fought back to back, two men against an endless tide of violence. And then as suddenly as it had started, the wave finally broke. The surviving Japanese soldiers retreated back into the smoke and jungle. The trench was filled with the dead and the dying. The living sat in stunned silence, covered in blood and white coral dust. Jake collapsed onto an ammunition crate, gasping desperately for air. His knuckles were split and bleeding. His rifle stock was gouged and battered. He looked down at his shaking hands and watched them tremble uncontrollably. Then he suddenly remembered the scope. He dropped to his knees and began digging frantically through the heavy sandbags. Carson helped him, both men throwing aside the bags until they found the canvas case. Jake unwrapped it as carefully as if it were made of butterfly wings. The unearthed scope was there, clean, safe, perfect. He held it up to the fading light with hands that would not stop shaking. The glass was crystal clear. The delicate spider silk crosshair was intact. Relief washed over him so powerfully that tears stung his eyes. Carson sat down heavily beside him. A fresh bandage was wrapped around his head, already soaking through with blood. "You keep that thing safe, kid. We still have a lot of work to do." Jake nodded silently. He carefully remounted the scope on the battered rifle, tightening the screws with hands that refused to stop trembling. He checked the alignment with obsessive care, still perfectly zeroed. The sun began to set over the Pacific Ocean, turning the entire sky blood red. Later that evening, a Marine patrol captured Captain Yamamoto while he was attempting to evacuate through the cave system. They treated his shoulder wound and brought him to battalion headquarters for interrogation. The interpreter spent an hour with him, then brought his words back to the command staff. Yamamoto had been remarkably cooperative once he understood his war was over. "I graduated from Tokyo University with highest honors in mathematics." Yamamoto had said, his voice weak from blood loss but carrying a strange kind of pride. "I personally trained more than 50 snipers for the Imperial Army. I have studied ballistics and trajectory calculations for 6 years." He paused to take a difficult breath. The American with the large glass scope calculated faster than me. He thought 3 moves ahead, like a master playing shogi. He saw my trap before I finished setting it. He shot more accurately at longer range, despite having similar equipment. The interpreter hesitated before translating the next part. "Captain Yamamoto says the American is not simply lucky. He says he is highly educated in mathematics. He says you should be extremely proud of him." When Carson told Jake about Yamamoto's statement, Jake's only response was characteristically brief. "Math does not care about nationality or which side you fight for. 2 + 2 = 4 in any language." The battle for Peleliu continued for another 6 brutal weeks. The 1st Marine Division was systematically chewed up by the Umerbrugel pocket. Regiments that had landed with 3,000 men would leave with fewer than 1,000, but something had changed in how the Marines fought. Jake Mitchell became known as the Hand of God. When a patrol was pinned by a hidden machine gun, they did not wait for artillery that might never come. They called for the man with the long rifle. Jake would appear, set up his impossible weapon with its fragile glass tube, and the problem would disappear. Sometimes it took 1 shot, sometimes it took 20, but the problems got solved. He stopped counting kills after the first week. The numbers felt obscene. What mattered was that his calculations saved lives. For every trigger pull, there were Marines who made it another 10 yards without dying. By late October, when the first division was finally pulled off the line, Jake looked like a ghost. He had lost 23 pounds. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull. His hands shook constantly, except when they held the rifle. The unertl scope was battered and scarred. The black finish was worn completely off the adjustment knobs. The aluminum mounts were scratched and dented, but the glass remained perfect. Jake had protected that optic more carefully than his own body. When the armorer took the rifle for processing, it felt like an amputation. Serial number 3928471, the armorer said, making notes on a clipboard. This one's got a history now. Jake nodded, unable to speak. He walked away with empty hands, feeling lighter but also naked. Carson found him on the transport ship, staring at the island as it disappeared behind them. You going to be okay? Calculator? Jake did not answer right away. Finally, he said, What do I do now, Sarge? I only know how to calculate death. Carson lit 2 cigarettes and handed one to Jake. You will figure it out. You are the smartest guy I ever met. He paused. And Jake, your old man would be proud. Jake returned to Hickory Corners, Michigan in December of 1944. There was a parade. The mayor made a speech. They hung a banner across Main Street that said, Welcome home, hero. Jake stood in his dress blues with the silver star on his chest and hated every second of it. Someone asked him to describe killing Japanese soldiers. He excused himself and walked alone to his father's grave in the snow. The headstone was simple granite. George Mitchell, 1898 to 1942, Guadalcanal. Jake knelt in the frozen ground and placed his silver star on the snow-covered earth. I finished the math, Dad. I used the glass just like you said I could. His voice cracked, but I do not think I can calculate anymore. The numbers have faces now. He tried to return to normal life. He enrolled at the University of Michigan to study mathematics. He sat in classrooms where professors praised his genius, but he could not sit still. Too many windows, too many angles. His mind automatically calculated range and windage for targets that did not exist. He lasted 1 semester before he quit and took a job at the lumber mill where his father had worked, cutting timber, operating saws, manual labor that silenced the nightmares, at least during the day. He married Emma Hayes in the spring of 1946. She was patient and kind and never asked questions when he woke up screaming. On their wedding night, he cried and could not explain why. She held him and said, You are home now. That is all that matters. Life moved forward the way it does. Children came, 2 boys and 2 girls. Jake taught them mathematics at the kitchen table, but never took them hunting. When they asked why, he just said he had done enough shooting for 1 lifetime. The years passed. Korea came and went, Vietnam. Jake watched the news and saw young men with scoped rifles doing the same work he had done. The technology improved, the optics got better, but the math stayed the same. In June of 1952, Marines in dress uniforms appeared at his door. Corporal Mitchell, the Marine Corps, needs you to train scout snipers. 3 weeks at Quantico, not to fight, just to teach. Jake, now 28 but looking 40, shook his head. I do not shoot anymore. We do not need you to shoot, sir. We need you to teach them to think. After the Marines left, Emma found him sitting on the porch. You should go, she said quietly. I cannot hold a rifle again. Then do not hold a rifle. Hold a chalkboard. At Quantico, Jake taught 40 young Marines the mathematics of long-range shooting. He never touched a weapon, just chalk and blackboard. He filled it with equations for bullet drop, wind drift, temperature effects. Bullet drop at 800 yards and 70-degree temperature with 30% humidity and 10-mile-per-hour crosswind. Who can solve this? Silence. Nobody. This is high school trigonometry. A young corporal raised his hand. Sir, we are Marines. We shoot. We do not calculate. Jake set down the chalk. He rolled up his sleeve, showing the faded pencil marks that would never fully wash away. I was a Marine too. I shot, but I calculated first. He pointed at the equation. Every one of these numbers is a man who went home to his family. Every miscalculation is a Marine who did not. The classroom went quiet. You think shooting is about courage. It is not. Courage is what happens after you do the math and realize how bad the odds are and you take the shot anyway. He picked up the chalk. Now someone solve this equation or I am keeping you here until you do. They learned, slowly, grudgingly, but they learned. One young Marine struggled, could not hit past 600 yards. Sir, I am not good enough. Jake looked at him, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Not a happy smile, a knowing one. You think I was good? I was terrified. Every single shot, he rolled up his sleeve again. But I did the math. And math does not care if you are scared. Letters came from Korea that winter. Trainees writing to thank him. One said, I made a 920-yard shot today, used your formula. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the rifle, but the math did not shake. Thank you for teaching me that fear and accuracy can coexist. Jake read that letter to Emma and understood something he had not before. He had given those young men his father's gift, not just the mathematics, the permission to be afraid and still do the job. The years rolled on. Jake worked the lumber mill until retirement. He raised his children. He refused every interview about the war. To his neighbors, he was just the quiet guy who could fix anything with a wrench. In 1973, he received a letter informing him that Sergeant Daniel Carson had died of a heart attack in Kentucky. Jake cried reading it. It was the first time Emma had seen him cry about the war. In 1995, he took his grandson Tyler deer hunting. The boy was 20. Jake was 71. Grandpa, you never shoot, you just watch. Jake smiled. I calculated enough killing for one lifetime. Now I just observe. Tyler made a clean shot at 300 yards. Jake watched the deer drop and felt his father's presence like a hand on his shoulder. Good math, he said quietly. Your great-grandfather would be proud. Jake Mitchell died on June 12, 1998, heart failure, peaceful. Emma was holding his hand when he went. In his final moments, he whispered numbers she did not understand. Elevation, windage, the same calculations he had written on his arm 54 years before. Then he smiled and said something she almost missed. I see you, Dad. The math was right. His family found a locked footlocker in the basement. Inside was the silver star he had never worn, a notebook filled with ballistics calculations, letters from Korean War snipers thanking him, a photograph of him and Carson on Peleliu standing by the rifle. And a note in his handwriting, the rifle is in the museum, serial 3928471. It was not mine. It belonged to the math. The math belonged to my father. I was just the one who remembered to carry the one. Today in the National Museum of the Marine Corps, there is a display case in a quiet corner. Inside sits a 1903 Springfield with serial number 3928471. Mounted on top is a Unertl 8 Power Scope, impossibly long, still pristine after 80 years. Most visitors walk past it. They want tanks and flamethrowers. They see the skinny rifle and think it looks like something for shooting tin cans. They do not know the story. But sometimes a young Marine stops, reads the placard, studies the scope. An older Marine, working as a guard, notices. You know what minute of angle means, son. Yes, sir. Mitchell could hold 5 MOA in 115-degree heat with people trying to kill him in 1944. With that, the young Marine stares at the rifle with new respect. The guard continues, voice softer now. He did not shoot to kill. He shot so someone else could live. That is the only calculation that ever mattered. The museum closes, the lights dim, the rifle sits in its case waiting, the glass pipe, the mail-order toy, the hand of God. Silent now, but the math remains. The math always remains. And somewhere in the eternal arithmetic of courage and sacrifice, Jacob Mitchell still carries the one.